Hi everyone, and welcome to Lesson 6 entitled Evaluating a Speech. Our learning objective for this lesson is to be able to provide a thorough and well-supported evaluation of a speech's underlying argument and its effective use of rhetoric. So for this final lesson in our first sequence of Unit 1 lessons, we're really going to be putting all of the pieces together. We're going to be pulling from each of the different skill sets that we've been gathering through these first 5 lessons, and we're going to be putting them to work here in Lesson 6 as we evaluate speeches. Now, our driving question for this lesson is, what does it actually mean to evaluate something? Yes, I'm familiar with that word. I kind of get what it means, but what am I actually looking for to determine the overall value of a speech? Well, I promise you, by the end of this video, you are going to have some very, very specific things to look for so that this process feels a lot less open-ended and intimidating than it may now. Now, just to give you an idea of where we are going, I'm going to introduce you to one of the most iconic speeches in American history, the Gettysburg Address. Even if you have not yet read this speech, very likely you have heard of this. It was delivered by our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, during the time period of the Civil War, a time period in which our nation was exhausted by the casualties and the sacrifices of a many years battle. It was bloody. It was awful, and there were many people that were just ready to give up and be like, "Hey, let's split ourselves in two, go our separate ways, and move on." Abraham Lincoln believed firmly in retaining the power of the Union. He wanted to pull both of these sides together, and he wanted to encourage a very weary Union to continue with the fight because he knew that it was the right thing for our nation in the long run. Now, despite the fact that this is one of the most famous speeches in our nation's history, remember, it is a speech written by a completely imperfect individual, and we have plenty of room to identify both strengths and weaknesses within this text. And that's precisely what I'm going to challenge us with doing. Now, we may not feel equipped for that task right now, but I promise you in about 10 minutes, we're going to feel like we know exactly what to do as we approach this piece and try to evaluate it. So let's get to the core of our question. What does it mean to actually evaluate something? Now, it's kind of interesting to note that evaluation is actually one of the most critical skills that our brain can perform. So if this feels tough at any point, know that it is tough, right? This is not something that should be able to be done while you are half awake or only partially focused. Evaluation really requires your full attention, your full engagement. So please try to lean into that. Now, what does evaluation involve? Well, it involves a careful appraisal of a subject, in our case, various speeches. And then that careful appraisal is followed by a fair, well-reasoned, and thoroughly supported judgment of its merits. Now, when we hear judgment, you may be thinking opinion. And that's in part true, right? We are going to be formulating opinions about these various speeches. So they're not fact. They are certainly our judgments, and others may disagree with those. But we want to make sure that the judgments that we do form are fair, well-reasoned, and that we can back them up with solid evidence from that speech or from what we know about that speech. So then what exactly are we looking for when we are judging a speech? Well, we have 3 particular areas that we're going to focus on. The first one is the core argument itself. The second is the speaker's rhetorical choices, be that their tone, their use of rhetorical appeals, their use of rhetorical devices. And lastly, the speaker's actual delivery of that speech. Remember that speeches were never intended to live on paper alone. They were written with the intention of being performed. When we have the opportunity to actually witness that performance, it becomes a whole new layer that we can actually take in, observe, evaluate, and then write and speak about. So let's take each of those categories and break them down into a little bit more detail and formulate some actual questions that we can ask ourselves as we approach a particular text. So the first thing what we want to note is that all texts make some kind of argument, right? They all have some kind of angle, something that they are trying to convince us of or persuade us of or have some sort of impressive effect upon us. So we want to begin by asking, what claim is the text making? Is that claim or thesis stated explicitly, or is it a little bit more implied? Do you have to kind of work to figure out what that central claim is? You may also ask, is that claim very clearly defined in black or white, right? Or is that claim qualified in some way? Meaning, are there little caveats attached to it, conditions attached to it? Next, we can ask, how is the claim supported? What reasons, what evidence are provided? Are they sound? Are they sufficient? Are they credible? Or is maybe evidence lacking? And lastly, does the speaker employ any counter arguments? We know that counter arguments are like a 1-2 punch, right? They add so much strength to our arguments. So if we do see counter arguments, are they presented accurately and respectfully so as not to alienate their audience or their opposition? How successfully does the speaker rebut these points? Maybe they have a great counterclaim. They've identified that alternative perspective. But if they don't effectively tear down that argument, then is it really adding strength to their piece? And then finally, do you detect any fallacies or faulty reasoning? Remember that there are certain pitfalls that we can fall into when we are making arguments. They are reasoning that perhaps on the surface sound accurate, but for which we know, because we are intelligent and we are astute, they are actually rooted in falsehoods, right? We're talking about things like either or fallacies, broad generalizations, and things of that nature, appeals to false authority. So we want to kind of revisit some of those famous fallacies that we've learned in our previous English courses and ensure that we don't see any of these within the speeches that we're viewing. Next up, let's talk about rhetorical choices. We know that strong and effective speeches are totally different from traditional essays. Traditional essays are super academic, but these speeches, they're going to incorporate well-selected rhetorical choices specifically tailored to the speaker's audience, occasion, and purpose. Remember that rhetorical triangle. So we can ask ourselves, does the speaker employ any appeals other than just logical ones? We want to make sure that they are indeed persuading our brain that there is a solid and well-supported argument at the core of this speech. But if they use pathos, if they use ethos, are they used effectively? And if so, how? We can additionally ask, is the speaker's tone well-suited to his or her audience and purpose, right? Does the tone motivate them? Does it create common ground? Or if it's inappropriately chosen, does it actually kind of turn the audience off, maybe even alienate them? Lastly, we can ask, does the speaker effectively use rhetorical devices that are clear, persuasive, and engaging? These are three important words to consider because they really help us to kind of focus in on those rhetorical devices and take a more objective view, right? Do they actually sway our opinion? Do they hold our attention? Do they hook us in? All right, and last but not least, let's think about that delivery. Now, when it is possible, and we know that sometimes it's not possible depending upon the age of your speech, but when it is possible to view a live recording of your speech, being delivered, an evaluator can actually additionally assess the speaker's use of voice and body, which are additional tools in that argumentation, that speech delivery. Things that we can look for and listen for are the speaker's posture, movement, eye contact with the audience. Do they come off confident? Do they come off maybe a little bit shy or unprepared? Do they come off as genuine and likable? Sometimes our body language can communicate those kinds of things. We want to look for the speaker's vocal quality, volume, pacing, and emphasis. Do they work to the strength of the piece? Or if maybe they have one of those vocal qualities that's like just really not pleasing to hear, maybe that actually detracts from it. Lastly, consider the speaker's preparedness to speak. All right, so now let's circle back to the Gettysburg Address. So we have identified 3 particular things that we can look to within each of these speeches in order to formulate that evaluation. And we've also broken down each of these concepts into several questions that we can ask ourselves to really kind of get to the heart of the strengths and the weaknesses inherent in these various speeches. Now remember, we said that the Gettysburg Address is iconic, and yet if we approach this with all of the awareness of the rhetorical situation, when we read thoroughly and we sort of examine not just the core argument, but Lincoln's use of rhetorical choices, then we're able to really formulate some very critical and thoughtful opinions rooted in some solid evidence here. So I'm going to ask that everyone pause their video momentarily and read this very brief speech to yourself. So now that you have read the Gettysburg Address, now let's take a look at some sample evaluations. Now, every evaluation is going to be made up of 2 parts. The first part is simply a statement of your opinion or your judgment. That comes from you. After sort of experiencing the speech and thinking very critically about all of these different pieces, you're going to provide a single statement that expresses your opinion. For example, Lincoln's central argument is remarkably powerful in its simplicity. That's my judgment. Now, in order to elevate this beyond just a basic opinion and make it an evaluation, I have to support it in a thoughtful and reasonable manner. So I would say, his purpose is to urge the weary Union to maintain their fight for unity and equality. However, he chooses to move his audience through the use of a single claim and a powerful call to action. Lincoln emphasizes that the fallen soldiers that they are present to honor sacrificed their lives for a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He then challenges each member of the audience to recommit themselves to the mission of the war, such as, "These dead shall not have died in vain." This call to action is incredibly inspiring in its specificity and its pathos or emotional appeal. One would find this request nearly impossible to deny. So you can see how I went beyond my simple statement or opinion and used all of the various details that I've observed throughout this text in order to support that position. Now I have a second sample evaluation, which you can pause and review on your own. But let's go ahead and wrap things up. So in conclusion, evaluation is the process of carefully appraising a subject of the purpose for the purposes of generating a fair, well-reasoned, and thoroughly supported judgment. There are 3 particular parts of a speech that we can examine in our effort to evaluate them, which includes that core argument, the speaker's rhetorical choices, and, when possible, the speaker's delivery. Now, you want to remember that your judgment is rooted in opinion, so don't forget to justify it with evidence from the speech and your knowledge of the rhetorical situation. That's that soapstone piece that we've learned. All right, good luck in this last step of this phase of our unit.